Today, the History Club was able to talk to Professor Kyle Ward. Ward is the director of the Social Studies Education Program and teaches both the methods courses and specializes in history education and the use of textbooks in the classroom. He also teaches an introductory U.S. history course and a class on World War II and the Holocaust. He's currently teaching at Minnesota State University. In addition to this, he's also written several books such as History vs. History, History in the Making, In the Shadow of Glory, Not Written in Stone, History Lessons, and The Other Side of the Story. Most of these having to do with historiography. One was a history resource for teachers, and another one with U.S. history perspectives from around the world and how other countries cover it. During our talk, he discusses his work, especially with traveling and studying other nations' history books, and how the U.S. history has been covered the same or differently. After describing some of his interesting findings, we had a Q&A with him. Some of the questions that our club asked had to do with Canadian history and Native Americans, JFK, the Alamo, slavery, the current state of history education, and some helpful skills for history students. We hope you enjoy the talk. Hello, Professor Ward. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Really good.
Fantastic. Thank you for introducing me. And thank you all for taking time out to do this. I really appreciate this. So let me just dive in. I'll have a few words, and what I really want to get to is kind of the question and answer, to see if I can answer any things, thoughts, and things that you've been thinking about along the way here. So first of all, as you probably know, my name is Kyle Ward. I'm the Director of Social Studies Education at Minnesota State University, Mankato. I'm in the history department, so along with teaching social studies methods, so like your social studies teacher sitting here, I would have trained him had he come to Mankato. But I also teach some history classes, mostly 20th century U.S. history. And right now, my area of specialty teaching class is on World War II. So World War II and the Holocaust are areas I spend a little bit more time on. So usually when I give talks or have chances to talk to students like this, some of the questions I get right away is like, why textbooks? These big, massive, boring textbooks that are out there. Why do you sit around and read all these all the time here? So to start with, I was actually a classroom teacher. I was a middle school and high school teacher for a number of years here in Minnesota. And what I noticed over the years here is that when my students would come to my class, I always kind of got the same, oh, history's so boring. Why do we have to do this? This is such a useless class. And I just kind of kept getting told this again and again and again. I kept thinking, well, that's kind of weird because I find it just to be this really fascinating topic. Yet my students just really seem to be bored in the classroom. And what I kind of discovered after a while is that what I found so interesting about it, which is there are different interpretations and there are different biases and there are different perspectives that people bring to history all the time that kind of keeps it changing. So I need to try to figure out something to do along with that. So I was thinking, okay, how do I show my students this? And I happened to be in I was getting a master's degree in history, and I was in a graduate level course. And the professor was talking, and he had been in Russia and he had studied in Russia. And we got to World War II, and he started talking about the end of World War II. And he goes, oh, by the way, it's kind of interesting. Russian textbooks very rarely mention, this would have been back in like the 1970s and 80s when he was a student over there. He said they very rarely mentioned the atomic bombs. He said there might be a little footnote or, oh yeah, by the way, the US dropped a couple of bombs, stuff like that. But according to Russian history textbooks, they claim that once they declared war against Japan, you can see that within 5 days, Japan surrenders and World War II comes to a complete end. So that was the perspective. And I remember sitting in that class going, well, that's just wrong. That's not the way I learned it. So it has to be obviously wrong here. There's no question about that. And I started thinking, well, if the Russians were saying that and they disagree with us, who is saying other things about us as well? So this leads to what historiography is, which is the history of history or the study of history. Like, what has impacted the way we learn this over time? How do we see things differently? How do we understand other people's viewpoints as well? So a colleague of mine and we started doing some research into this, and we discovered over in Germany, there's an institute called the George Eckert Institute, and it's in Braunschweig, Germany. And they are a UNESCO site, so the UN actually sponsors them, and they collect history textbooks from around the world. So they have this repository, this library of like probably about 90,000 to 100,000 history textbooks over time and from all these different countries there as well. So I got a couple of fellowships, had the chance to go over, and we started collecting all these different textbooks and putting them together. And then just by doing that, I started to discover too that there's a purpose for history textbooks beyond just, hey, students read all this information here. And what I usually tell future teachers now is that the purpose of a history class is to create future citizens. And so these are civic lessons. I can give a quick example. If the teacher in the classroom wouldn't mind helping me out, can you go around and ask everybody, if you think of a cover of your U.S. history textbook or your U.S. government textbook, what are the things you guys usually see on the textbook cover?
So Jaden, we'll go around. Yeah, you're talking U.S. history textbooks, correct?
Yep, U.S. history, U.S. government, U.S. civics.
Flags. Did you hear that?
No, I couldn't hear.
I'd say a lot of stuff that kind of, I would say, promotes a feeling of patriotism in ourselves. Like you see like George Washington, American flags, bald eagles, maybe like Mount Rushmore.
Oh yeah, yeah. Anything anybody else can think of that they've seen in a history textbook?
Like crossing the Delaware.
The Statue of Liberty.
Stuff, yeah. So, go ahead.
The Transcontinental Railroad sometimes.
Oh, another really good one. So, yeah, if you think about the images, and you're exactly right. I mean, the American flag, the Lincoln Memorial, the crossing of the Delaware, flag raising at Iwo Jima. The one I always find kind of interesting is the Alamo shows up on a lot of history textbooks, which I always find kind of funny because that was technically a loss, but it says something about Americans if you know the entire story behind it as well. So you can just see, just by looking at the cover of these textbooks, there's a message we're trying to get to future generations. And within these books is a roadmap as to how you can become a better citizen. And every country does this. We had a chance to look at a textbook from Malta, and I was looking at this, and they were going through and explaining, if you're going to be Maltese, these are the things that made us great over the time. And they started connecting to all these great world moments in history. And during World War II, this happened here. And during the Cold War, they were doing this. And we were here. We were right in the center of all this. So if you want to be a future citizen of our country, these are the things that you're going to need. Well, we started going through all these textbooks, and we were getting them translated, and we're starting to read the different stories that were out there. And so some of the ones that had jumped out at us that people usually have quick questions about. The first one is almost always North Korea comes up. A lot of people have seen the North Korean textbooks, and their version of history and our version of history, especially when it comes to like the Korean War. I was surprised to find out that the North Koreans won the Korean War. And they did so by their great and powerful leader. And they thwarted the Americans from coming in, and they pushed them off the continent. And reading through all this, I thought, man, this does not sound anything like what our textbooks are saying whatsoever here. So you see some of those things. By the way, this is a quick, interesting side note. In North Korea, in their math textbooks, we came across, and because we were focusing on history, we would include this, but in their math textbooks, they'd have programs like, if you pointed your gun south and there were 15, the reference is usually devil dogs, meaning either South Koreans or Americans who are living there. And they use devil dog. It's a really terrible thing in their language, meaning that Americans, as they see, we're not pure like North Koreans are. We've got all these mixed in groups of people and stuff like that. And it was just ridiculous things like, if you shoot your gun and you kill 10 of the 15 that were standing in front of you, how many do you have left and stuff like that? It's like, okay, wow, that is a unique math lesson that they've got. So they go through and have a number of things like that as well. Countries that we thought we looked at it, we said, well, there's not going to be really anything here, but we'll read and see what they have to say. England was extremely surprising to us, because the English seem to have a lot of different interpretations of things. One, which we kind of probably should have thought would have been obvious, but the American Revolution, their version of the textbook, first of all, the Sons of Liberty that we hold up, going back to what was said before about how patriotic and how these textbooks are and stuff like that. The Sons of Liberty in British textbooks are terrorists. They make no bones about it. These were horrible individuals who were thwarting the law, causing numerous problems. There's one textbook that refers to George Washington as an executioner, that he was killing his own men. And they kind of explain, these men were deserting. They didn't want to fight for the American cause anymore, so George Washington had them killed. There's some truth to that, but the way it was written was like George was just walking around going, "Oh, you deserted. We're going to execute you. We're going to execute you," and things like that as well. And then the thing that I found the most interesting, again, going back to my World War II area, is that what we refer to here as the special relationship. And I actually heard this on a sitcom not too long ago, and referring to the United States and England by saying, we have this special relationship, which means to us, we are really good friends. We're the best of friends, and we get along, and we agree on foreign policy and everything else like that. And that came out of World War II because Churchill and FDR were so close and stuff. What's interesting is in the 2000s, that story disappears, and British textbooks make a special point of saying the special relationship was a myth. Basically, the Americans came in, kicked down the door, and said, "This is how we want things done. This is going to be the way we do it," things like that. I like to ask people this question. I'll throw it out to all of you as well. It's tricky Trivial Pursuit, so I'll understand if you don't know. But by the late 1990s, early 2000s, so by about 2004, 2005, the special relationship in British textbooks disappears, and it's now all of a sudden referred to as a myth. Whenever you do historiography, you always got to look at the date of when things were written and go, okay, why would it have changed at this time? Do any of you have any guesses or ideas why in the early 2000s do the British all of a sudden start saying this special relationship never really existed?
Does it have something to do with like the terrorism attacks that took place in the early 2000s in America?
I missed the last part there. Sorry about that.
Does it have anything to do with the terrorism attacks that took place in America in the early 2000s?
If you look back and see when the war on terror starts, the British are going to be willing to send in troops, but then they get stuck in this war that all of a sudden they say, well, this really wasn't our war. We got stuck with it, and we got drug into it because of the Americans. So the special relationship becomes a myth for them over there. So yeah, exactly the problem they have. Canada, real quick, the last two things, I'm going to open it up to questions for everybody here, is that Canadian textbooks, same type of thing. We thought, oh, our 51st state, the neighbors to the north, we get along beautifully. There's not going to be a difference. Wow. Canadian textbooks go after American culture. They do not like McDonald's. They don't like MTV. They don't like all the things that are being flooded into their country. They think they're losing some of their identity because of all that. And I never thought about this, but if you go back to like the War of 1812, Canada was invaded by the United States because we were fighting Britain. In Canadian textbooks, they refer to it as an invasion against Canada. And they even say that they became a nation because of that constant fear of the United States invading them. So they needed to form their own nation, have their own government, own military and stuff like that because of this constant fear of what was going to happen as well. And the last thing I'll leave you with, because a lot of students I get this question a lot too, 9/11. What happened on 9/11 is interesting. It shows up in almost, I can't think of a history textbook around the world that doesn't talk about 9/11. What we found interesting, though, in my research, is that textbooks from around the world like to say, yes, what happened in 9/11, horrible, horrible tragedy, no question asked. But then they go on to say, this wasn't the only terrorist act that happened in the world. And they're insinuating, in my personal opinion, that, okay, yeah, it happened to America, and America's so important, and they think the whole world revolves around them. But there's been terrorism going on in all these other countries and all these other places and stuff like that. And they almost always list, this is what happened in Japan, this is what happened in this country, and places like that, with all these different terrorist attacks. So it always kind of puts it in a larger global perspective, too, of going, okay, this is what matters to us, and this is what matters to them. And when I was over at the Eckert Institute, I always thought this was really interesting. We had a bunch of scholars from around the world, and we got into this conversation, and they were kind of being a little harsh on the United States, in my personal opinion. And finally, somebody said, okay, you need to understand, people from around the world see the U.S. in two different lights. One, we hate your government and military. We don't like your government. We don't like your military intruding all the time. But we love the American people, we love the culture, we love movies, music, and everything else that along with it too. So we have this kind of split relationship around the world where there's kind of this love-hate going back and forth because of their perceptions of us, which I think comes a lot from their understanding of their own history. All right. My students get bored listening to me after about 15 minutes, so I'm going to learn from that and cut this off real quickly. What questions do you all have? What thoughts and ideas, what examples can you share with me?
How much do Canadians talk about their native history? Because like we don't do a lot for ours, and we should. And I don't know if Canada's better or not. Good question.
They have the same debate going on up in Canada right now as we kind of do here. It shows up, but the complaint is it's usually shows up when the Native Americans are blocking Canadians from expanding and building cities and becoming a bigger nation and stuff like that. They're always on the outside, kind of looking in, is the situation that they have. So they're there. They do a better job because I think, in my personal opinion here, some of their tribes up there have a lot more political clout. And so you're seeing a little bit more attention being shown in curriculum, but overall, it's pretty much the exact same situation we have here.
When you're reading different textbooks from around the world, how do you differentiate from one another what actually happened or like the true story? How do you actually corroborate one textbook with another to see which one's actually telling or retelling the actual event?
So that's something that we actually do with my future teachers as well, is I give them some of those examples and then I ask them and say, okay, where's the truth in all of this? Because I mean, you've got like North Korea, which is an outlier. And sometimes it's little things like the different perspectives and like little comments and stuff like that. But then most of my students, and I would agree too, it's getting into the primary sources, getting into the people that were actually there. Textbooks give you a secondary source. Textbooks have those biases of, okay, we want to show our country in a certain light. So we're going to kind of change things just a little bit here, got different images and stuff like that. So yeah, I was trying to find those different resources. Another thing, a student, when I did use the North Korean one time, a student made the point and said, well, if you just look at all the other countries' resources compared to North Korea, you've got like all these other countries that are saying one story and then North Korea on the other. So yeah, you try to figure out by looking at those primary sources, where's the more historical truth?
I did a whole big project on the JFK assassination, and I was wondering your opinion on it, like on the whole entire event.
What was that last part?
Just your opinion on the event.
Obviously a tragic moment in US history. It's been interesting from a historiography standpoint because we have the official line of what's said, but there's been so many conspiracies that come along with it now too. And so depending on what takes place and what's been said, so the JFK assassination kind of follows what I was saying before about the Alamo. And real quick example, the Alamo was never mentioned in a US history textbook until the late 1950s, early 1960s. Man, this is just amazing Trivial Pursuit. My hat's off to anybody who gets this one. Does anybody know why the Alamo started showing up in the late 1950s, early 1960s? And I'll tie this back into JFK.
Texas. The last stand. Faded Mexico.
No, I don't.
You have a guess? Hollywood. John Wayne went out and made a movie in the 1950s about the Alamo. And then all of a sudden, textbooks started going, oh, this must have been a big event because this is a big movie. So all of a sudden, this battle that meant nothing to nobody all of a sudden started showing up here. Same thing if you notice, like with the JFK assassination, Oliver Stone came out with that movie in the early 1990s in which he started to, because he did it and gave some credence to some of the conspiracy theories that are out there, you start seeing more mainstream historians looking into these as well. So it's just little things like that along the way that kind of make the change. Did you have an analysis at the end of your paper? Or what was the final thoughts that you had?
Honestly, I ended up being like more confused than anything after gathering all the research.
You didn't find the quote unquote smoking gun. You can't point the finger at the exact person who did it. um, Not to get off track here, but do you fully believe that was Lee Harvey Oswald?
Like I said, I'm very confused. It makes me like really like question it.
Gotcha. It's not a good historian.
Now, in our history textbooks, do you think that tone of patriotism is necessary for people in that country that are reading it, or do you think there should be more of a sense of transparency for the events and everything?
Great question. Again, textbooks are being used to create future citizens, but I do think there should be a level of transparency to kind of let people know. When you pick up that massive 1,000-page textbook, I would say, outside of your classroom, at 99% of all students in this country, just if they are forced to read it and they actually do read it, I'll talk to your teacher later on about how many students actually do read the textbook. But when they're reading it, so many students just kind of take this as this is the facts. This is what was given to us, kind of a biblical type thing of I can't question this textbook ever. So I think the more questioning we have would be great. Over in England, one thing I really like that they do with their textbooks is they'll write a section, about a certain era in history, and then they bring in two historians who disagree on certain events. And so historian A from Cambridge is saying this about it, and historian B from Oxford or University of London is saying this about it. Our textbooks are just, here's the quote unquote facts, here's the information you need to know. If there's something interesting, like, boy, we better mention somebody from a certain group, put a little sidebar over and stuff like that. But we don't really let students debate or have what we call a historiographical debate about what's going on in our textbooks.
Do you think that in schools there should be more of a push for kind of inspiring that like curiosity for historiography, where there should be, like I say, more classes or courses where students actually get to dive deeper into the subjects rather than most of the time, especially throughout here, especially throughout my time here, it's we get a textbook and none of the bad parts of it were really told to us, right? It was kind of just, this is what happens. And especially in America, I feel like a lot of it is, oh, we join a war and we win. But do you think there should be more courses or like more encouragement in high school for that?
Yeah, 110%. Actually, at the university here, I'm meeting with the history department to start to create a historiography class that all my future social studies teachers would take, so they have a better understanding. I'll have to let your teacher chime in here or not, but in Minnesota, when you graduate with a social studies license, you're broad field license. So all my students have to, quote unquote, be experts in U.S. history, world history, Minnesota history, sociology, psychology, anthropology, government, economics, and political science. And those are the 9 areas that they have to be, quote unquote, experts in. And so they're not experts. So my theory is, if we could teach a historiography class, it takes the pressure off me, the teacher, because I don't have to know every single thing about it. I can all of a sudden turn to my students and go, hey, Native American, the textbooks, are they being treated fairly? Okay, here's what this chapter says about the Kennedy assassination, but is there more going on? And why would this story have changed over time? So yeah, I really wish we could get to a point where we'd have more historical thinking in the schools and not just the regurgitation of here's names, dates, and places, and you give those back to me.
Do you think that history repeats itself?
Sorry, say that again?
Or do you think history can or does repeat itself?
Yeah, I don't think it's a perfect connection, like, oh boy, we're going to run into this exact same thing again here. But if you start watching trends, you start noticing things over time, and it's like, okay, we might be kind of heading down this type of road again here. So gotta be careful not to do that. See you, gang.
Yeah, thank you so much.
See ya.
Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you.
I I wonder how different countries cover slavery, because I'm obviously American slavery is bad, and like kind of worse in some ways than other ones. But like other countries did it before and still do it.
That was a specific topic that we really dove into because I thought this is going to be interesting. And it really was. What happened, what was, I hate to make light of this, but was kind of funny, is that we started collecting, is like, okay, who was all involved with the slave trade? Okay, we had Portugal, we had the Dutch, we had the British, we had the Americans, kind of the four bigger groups that were out there, with the Portuguese probably being the first to start it all. And what was the funny part was, in Portugal, their textbooks usually say, yep, we were part of the slave trade. This is not a proud moment for us. But yeah, hey, we weren't the first. I mean, we went to Africa and they had slavery there already. So we just kind of fell in line with what they were doing. And then you start reading the Dutch and the British, and they're real quick to go, yep, we did it. We're guilty of having the slave trade. But it was the Portuguese. Portuguese were first, and they kind of, you know, because since they were doing it, we kind of had to move in on it too. And then the US, if you look at some US history textbooks, it's really quickly to say, yeah, we were part of the slave trade, but we were a British colony and the British were doing this. So we kind of got, you know, forced into doing this. And I'll be honest with you, one of my all-time favorite things I read doing all my research in history textbooks comes from a Nigerian textbook talking about the slave trade. And I looked it up and I was reading it and I thought, okay, this is going to be the worst catastrophe in history of mankind. And they do lay it out that way, saying we lost so many people. One thing that jumped out at me is the question of what did we lose? You know, how many teachers and philosophers and husbands and wives and doctors and inventors, what did we lose, you know, because of the situation of slavery? And then the weirdest thing, and it made sense after I read it, is the Nigerian textbooks, and I believe they still do this today in the west coast of Africa, but Nigeria, they said, and here's all the benefits that slavery brought us. And I thought, okay, well, that's just, I mean, imagine a US history textbook saying something terrible like, oh, here's all the benefits of all the things that, all the good things that came out of slavery. And you read it, and what's interesting is they said, well, yes, some people suffered miserably, but it brought a lot of wealth to our country. It brought some tribal control. It did some of these other things that they see as a benefit. So it's a really interesting mixed story coming out of Africa of the horrible, horrible situation should have never happened. But then there's this really weird silver lining that they sometimes point out and go, we benefit. Some people actually made a lot of money. Some people got a little more organized as well. Political systems were set up.
I'm curious as to how Japan covers something like bombings during World War II. Because I feel like a lot of times in America, we definitely address it, but it's not in depth. But then a lot of times the question kind of follows was like, was this morally just? Did we need to do this? I'm curious to see if like Japan says like this is a terrible thing, like no, that shouldn't have happened, or what they say about it.
Yeah. So the quick background to that story is years ago when I was a high school teacher, I taught at a private school here in Minnesota, and it was called the International School of Minnesota. And we had students from 39 different countries that were all represented at our school. And I'm teaching my ninth grade US history class, and we get to the atomic bombings. First of all, interesting dynamic. A young lady from Minnesota, her grandfather was one of the pilots for the bombing of Nagasaki. So I've got that portion of the story here. And then I've got a young lady, Yoko, from Japan in this class as well. And so I bring this up and it's like, okay, gang, help me out. Why did we drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And, you know, I'm getting to end the war, to send a message to Russia, you know, all this other thing. And Yoko has her hand up. And it's like, oh, okay, interesting. I'll call on her. And she said, she goes, because the American taxpayers had paid for it and they demanded that it be used. And it's that, and your teacher can maybe corroborate this with me. Have you ever had that situation, John, where a student says something like, this isn't really correct here? So you just kind of smile and go, Okay, moving on quickly.
Yeah,
Um,
that happens sometimes.
so she said this, and I kind of go, okay, we'll just move on. Well, a few years later, I'm in the American Institute, and I'm looking at a Japanese textbook, and somebody I know translates it. And one of the first causes that comes up is from that textbook, and it said, the American taxpayers paid for the atomic bomb, and they just demanded being used, which in my opinion is kind of a horrible thing to say, saying, hey, no, we know this is very destructive, but I spent money on it, so we got to do something with this along the way. So we got that. There, the other thing that comes up for Japan is in their textbooks, and this has irritated people in the United States for a long time. They very rarely they mention Pearl Harbor, but Pearl Harbor's like, oh yeah, the war started and we invaded some places and stuff like that to protect ourselves. And there's no surprise attack like you hear it from here. So they don't wrestle with the moral issues like we do, like if we should have. From their perspective, this is just a horrible thing to do. The war was coming to an end. The Americans just used it because the taxpayers and to make a Cold War effort to scare the Russians.
It's interesting. We have about 8.5 minutes left then.
Okay, sounds good.
With our recent presidents of Biden and Trump being viewed pretty like negatively by the rest of the world, are there any presidents that you can think of that were viewed more positive than the rest of the world?
There are two that come to mind. One, John Kennedy. The world seems to have this kind of eternal love affair with John Kennedy. I think being young and the way he is going to die is going to be one of the shocking things. And then the one thing I noticed looking at history textbooks from around the world, President Obama, it was absolutely positively adored around the world there. They had every textbook I ever saw had something about his inauguration, commenting on his impact on the world and things like that as well. So yeah, they definitely had that perspective. We don't seem to have that anymore, but at the time.
Are there any presidents that stick out where the global view is just overwhelmingly negative?
I haven't. This is just coming from colleagues that I've talked to, and we do some exchange programs with other universities. I've had the chance to go to Norway some. In Norway, Trump is viewed as very negatively. There's a lot of concerns about him, but I don't think he's showing up in the textbooks as of yet. Otherwise, no, not even Nixon doesn't even get, like, he's viewed a bit more negatively in our textbooks. I've never seen anybody really been given the a real once over or anything else like that because of policies and everything.
Similar to that question with the president viewed negatively, what have you seen out of all the other textbooks of some, I guess, U.S. intervention or something that the country's done that was viewed negatively?
Classic example is the Philippines. U.S. history textbooks say that in 1899, we have the Philippine-American War. We take over. It's a colony until after World War II, and then it's pretty much a protectorate of ours for a long time after. Filipino textbooks, especially in the last 15 to 20 years, where we've cut a lot of ties with the Philippines, so there's not that military or economic connection like we used to have. They're very clear on, we were invaded, they were an occupying country. They forced all this down our throats. Speaking of which, when I first started doing this research, I could order a Filipino textbook and read it because it was in an American English. Since then, they've gone back to their native language and they don't have textbooks in English. It's in Tagalog at this point in time. So you can see that kind of a change taking place. So yeah, there's a very negative. On the flip side, after World War II, German textbooks usually praised the United States for showing up with the Marshall Plan, and there's this kind of love affair with 1950s America and Elvis Presley and James Dean and stuff like that. You see that show up in a lot of German textbooks of the, okay, we survived World War II. Those of us who are here now, we've got this Americanization coming in. These are all the great things that we got because of our connection with the United States.
Is there any sort of documentation that you've seen from kind of like a primary source or like a textbook kind of from Hawaii, I guess, prior to the annexation?
Trying to think, that's an interesting question. No, nothing that I've seen, but that would be a really interesting perspective, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So we have about 4.5 minutes left. I wanted to ask you what your favorite topic is in history, and I think I asked you this last spring. Your favorite topic, advice to history students, and then any resources you can share with us to kind of wrap up the talk.
I usually fall back on 20th century US, but mostly World War II and the Holocaust. I've done some work with the US Holocaust Museum in the past, so that's my kind of fallback go-to. I'm old. I got the old social studies stereotype of being a former football coach who liked World War II, so I just have to apologize to my current students about that all the time here as well. And for future history people, if you're interested in it, keep being interested in it. Find subject or topics that you are interested in, just feel free to dive into, and then just follow those rabbit holes. Because as soon as you start reading one topic, you're gonna go, oh, that's really kind of interesting to know that, and follow this topic, and you just kind of go back and forth with it as well. If you go on to college, don't be afraid to major or even minor in history. I run a social science program, which is a kind of a liberal arts program. And we've had a lot of success with students because businesses and nonprofits and things like that like the fact that you have an understanding of the world, that you understand economics and politics, you've done research, you can do some writing and things like that. So they really appreciate somebody who can do that kind of thinking and have that thought process going on in their head as well here. And then resources, I'm trying to think here. John, do you remember what I mentioned last time?
We got one of these, and
that's the gold standard. That's what you're going to have to go with.
But if there's any like online resources, or you had talked about traveling to essentially go do research on what you said, thousands of books from other nations. Is there any like online resources like that, or any like wikis or anything?
There are, and I'll have to send these to you, but not so much international textbooks, but old U.S. history textbooks, because after we did the one on the worldviews, I went and did a book about how history has changed over time in the U.S. And there are a lot of places now have scanned in old textbooks going back to the 1700s. And so you can just kind of go in, and any topic you look for in historiography, just start when that starts, like, oh, the Civil War, I want to follow and see what happened with the Civil War. And if you ever really want to push the envelope, the Eckert Institute will make photocopies that scan portions of textbooks and could send those to you. So if you ever wanted to work with the foreign language teachers in the school, you could get, I'm working with a teacher in Michigan right now. He's ordering some Spanish section on the Spanish-American War, and the Spanish teacher is going to work with her class on translating that, and they're going to look at the historiography of how they view it versus how we view it.
Thank you so much, Professor Ward. I appreciate it. I'd love to do another one if you'd like, maybe on a different topic, but.
Yep. And please, the gentlemen who are sitting here and anybody else is in the room, if they ever have questions or they're doing research or anything like that, please share my email with them. I'd be very happy to share anything and help them out any way I can, and to recruit them to Minnesota Mankato, because when I'm looking at 14 inches of snow right now and sub-zero weather, so you should come.
Perfect. Thank you, Kyle.
All right. Thank you, guys. Nice seeing everybody.
See you.